Welcome to the OCO Roundtable podcast. My name is Jessica Detho. I am an associate in the Dispute Resolution Department. Joining me today is Brian Waguma, an associate as well at the Dispute Resolution Department. And we are completing our 4-part mini-series during this Labor Month. And the topic for today will be disability mainstreaming in the workplace. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you so much, Jess. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm also excited to be here. I hope you're well, and I hope you're excited for this episode.
Indeed, it's a pleasure and happy to discuss the topic for today. Perhaps we can begin by understanding what this concept of disability mainstreaming entails. It has been used severally, and it is worth letting our listeners understand what we mean by disability mainstreaming in the context of this conversation. Jessica, probably you can start us off by telling us what you mean by disability mainstreaming and why is it important?
So, in my view, I think disability mainstreaming is a strategy in which concerns the needs, the experiences of persons with disabilities. But I've just thought that maybe we should define what disability is first. So a disability has been defined in the Persons with Disabilities Act to mean a physical, sensory, mental, or other impairment including visual, hearing, learning, or physical incapability, which impacts adversely on social, economic, or environmental participation. A few other definitions that come to mind, Brian, is accessibility or reasonable accommodation. When we talk about reasonable accommodation in a workplace or accessibility in a workplace, what are we trying to convey?
Could that be the basis of disability mainstreaming, where you now start including aspects of employment or basically incorporation of PWDs in the socioeconomic and political spheres?
Yeah, I agree. And maybe we can discuss why disability mainstreaming is really important in the workplace and in general. But let us focus on the workplace.
In the workplace, just like in any other aspect, remember we've discussed about disability as encompassing both social, all possible spheres, social, economic, political, cultural, etc. And disability mainstreaming is one sure way of helping to facilitate inclusion of persons with disabilities. So the idea behind disability mainstreaming, in my view, is to help create awareness and to sensitize the public and the society into appreciating the importance of accommodating persons with disabilities so that they are not just seen as objects of pity or people to be supported through charity.
Yes, I agree. And I think it also touches on myths that are out there with respect to people with disabilities. I've heard a few things like for the overly religious people that people with disabilities are a result of a sin or a curse. Sometimes people say that people with disabilities are sick and in constant pain. And as you said, people with disabilities are special and should be treated differently, or they command some sort of pity from the rest of us. And I know those are complete myths, don't you think?
Yeah, those are just myths, and most of them will associate the disability as arising from those myths. If it is a sickness, a person who is over-religious will recommend to you to go see some prophets who perform healing so that they can get you healed. There are those people who believe that disability is a condition that renders someone incapable of working. In other words, disability deprives you of the capacity to be productive, and so you cannot work. Those are, in my view, subscribing to the belief that persons with disabilities, for them to survive, they need to be supported by way of charity. And those can be attributed to the various models of disability, the charity model, which I've just talked about, There is the medical model, which sees disability as a sickness, as a health issue. And then there's also the social model, which views disability as resulting from the environment, where the inaccessible environment is the reason for a person's disability. So if you have a building, a person with disability can access it if only that building has taken into account the measures that are normally discussed even in law. For example, for a wheelchair user, a building can be accessed if it is equipped with ramps, or if these elevators are wide enough, this is my understanding, to accommodate their wheelchair, so that what a regular person or someone without disability can access, the same can be accessed by a wheelchair user. So for me, the social model seeks to resolve the question of disability by addressing the limitations in the environment.
Yeah, and I think that feeds into the various barriers that persons with disabilities face. You have just mentioned the ramps and the lifts, and that is a definition of a physical barrier. We have talked about attitudinal barriers as well, where somebody has a particular concept of why somebody has a disability being maybe a sin or a curse. There are also communication barriers. Might you want to expound what communication barriers entail?
Yeah, absolutely. So communication barriers may exist in many forms, one of which I would say is disability etiquette, and this concerns how you address persons with disabilities, because that would determine whether you are an agent of inclusion or you are contributing to that feeling of them being excluded because they have a disability. There's also the aspect of access to information, and disability can be a reason why someone may be limited in accessing information that is available to the public. Some of us, we have seen news is read on TV, some information is displayed on the screen, but for someone who is visually impaired, they cannot have access to that. And it is because their disability presents that barrier for them to access information. So those are two key examples which I would attribute to being a barrier in communication for persons with disabilities. But having said that, maybe when it comes to employment, it is necessary that we understand why is it important in employment to include persons with disabilities. Is it because of affirmative action? And even if it is a reason, is it the primary reason? What is the purpose of disability mainstreaming in terms of employment?
Yeah, I think there are various reasons. To begin with, they are people capable of carrying out their tasks, and I think that should be the basis, that they can carry out the tasks that are being done by people without disabilities. Say, for example, as a lawyer, if you have access to reasonable accommodation, say you have a laptop that actually has the software required for a visually impaired person to work, then there's no reason why that person shouldn't be able to carry out the tasks of the day.
That's absolutely true. And I also believe that it is aimed at ensuring that we tap into the potential as a society of everybody, because disability does not define an individual's potential. As a society, we may deny ourselves great resources that are possessed by individuals with disabilities because we have chosen to isolate them on account that their disability does not enable them to work. And by dismantling that thought, that kind of attitude, we will be able to achieve a lot as a country. So, in my view, affirmative action that is provided for by the Constitution under Article 54 is not just for purposes of including PWDs for cosmetic reasons. It is also for the benefit of the country. Imagine if you hire one person with disability. Remember, the income they earn is also going to support other dependents. Compare that to when you prefer charity. How many people with disability will you support in terms of charity versus how many people do you stand to support by hiring a person with disability? So it is a sustainability issue. Employment of PWDs contributes to sustainability, and that is good for the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to that, in addition to sustainability or just the basic right thing to do, we have seen efforts by different policies and laws that also offer incentives to employers who hire persons with disabilities. For example, I know Section 16 of the Persons with Disability Act gives a private employer tax incentives and deducts their taxable income where they have employed a person with disability. And it goes further where they're given tax benefits if the employer modify their physical facilities or avail special services in order to provide reasonable accommodation for employees with disabilities. However, with incentives also comes responsibilities and obligations that are placed on the employer with respect to the employees who have disabilities. For example, Section 12 of the Persons with Disabilities Act stops the denying of a person with disability access to opportunities for suitable employment, and further at Section 15, where they are at that employment, the employer is prohibited from discriminating against them with relation to their disability. And I've seen a few cases that have cropped up or come up as a result of this. A case that comes easily to mind is that of Wilson Macharia versus Safaricom. And the brief facts of this case is that the petitioner applied for a position at the respondent company, went through the interview process, and he was given a job offer by the respondent company via an offer letter which indicated his start date and the training process. However, after they found out that he was visually or is visually impaired, they revoked the letter of offer on the basis that it was erroneously issued to him. Obviously, he went to court and filed the petition that we're now talking about, and the court did hold that there was discrimination against the petitioner on the basis of his visual impairment and proceeded to award him damages worth 6 million shillings. Brian, might you know any other case that touches on discrimination on account of disability?
Yeah, I know of one particular case, although I may not recall the specific parties, but it was about a person, petitioner in this case, who had been dismissed on medical grounds after he was involved in an accident, and then the person lost the ability to walk. The person was serving in the police service, and so after he got the accident, I think those period that he was in the hospital, after they had lapsed, he was presented with a letter terminating him on medical grounds, and he went to court and sued, claiming that he was discriminated against, that the medical ground was not satisfied because that was a case of disability. The person had not lost capacity to work, and that means it was possible for the employer to redeploy him to a role or to undertake duties which he would be able to carry out in his circumstances. But the employer made no effort to that end, and the court found that the dismissal was unfair. The employer was ordered to reinstate the petitioner, and that is how the petitioner got back his job.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. I think something that comes to mind, particularly with this case, is that disability must be directly linked to capability of working while in the employment. So coming from your case of the police officer who got into an accident and lost use of his legs, the court directed that he ought to have been redeployed to a position where probably he was now a desk officer, for example. So the employer must satisfy that the person's disability has made them completely unable or lacking the capacity to work. Another example would be, for example, in a construction site, and somebody has lost use of their arms, that is directly linked to the work at the construction site. And therefore, the employer ought to redeploy the person, if possible, to a desk job, for example.
Yeah, and that's just to say that termination cannot be on a ground of disability, or disability cannot immediately constitute a medical ground for termination of a person from employment. So like Jessica, you have correctly said, you have to satisfy that this disability has rendered this person incapable of performing their tasks at work. Perhaps the question one would ask is, so how then do I proceed to hire a person with disability if it is at all a constitutional requirement? And the question that most employers would gamble with are mostly linked to what they know as of attitude. For example, if I hire a person with disability to occupy a position as secretary or personal assistant, how do I know that they are capable of doing this role? First, there is an interview process, and if a person with disability performs well in an interview process and they are qualified to be hired, an employer should not be worried about their capabilities, because the moment they have demonstrated in the interview that they are capable of discharging the role applied for, then you proceed to hire the person. But because this is a person who will need to be accommodated, Jessica, you talked about reasonable accommodation. I would advise that employers undertake what we call disability assessment, so as to ascertain the needs of this person, because being or having a disability is not a guarantee that even the person is aware of how the employer can accommodate them. Disability assessment is a matter to be done by a competent person or an expert in matters of disability. So they assess this person, get to know what their needs are, so that they make recommendations to the employer on what they can do to ensure that this person is sufficiently accommodated. Once you do that, you can be sure that you will have contributed to facilitating employment for persons with disability. Employment should not be for the sake of ticking the boxes, that because you have hired a person with disability, you use that to advance the belief that you are an inclusive, employer. That is not the case. At the end of the day, even with disability, still we don't forgo merit. Disability is not an excuse to ignore merit. So even that interview process, hiring of persons with disability, should always be based on merit. What we are simply saying is that an employer should not be blinded by a person's disability to deny an opportunity to a person with disability.
Thank you so much for that, Brian. And as we wind down on our podcast, we really want to encourage employers to employ persons with disabilities, because as we've discussed, it contributes to the wider goal of sustainability, in the fact of you would rather teach a man to catch a fish than give the man the fish.
Wow. Thank you, Jessica, for sharing your great insights with us. With that, we reach the end of our 4th episode today, in which we are discussing about disability mainstreaming at the workplace. And that marks the close of our 4-part mini-series of the Labor Man. We would also like to thank you, our listeners, for taking time to join us. And we hope that you found our discussions to be enlightening. And we invite you to listen to more of this and other topics by subscribing to our podcast. We value your feedback, and you can also share your feedback by reaching us through our social media channels using the hashtag OCO Roundtable. Until then,
goodbye and take care.